Did you know that the water industry is staring down a 60,000 job shortage that could leave cities struggling to supply clean water? It's a crisis that's coming fast, and one that a few people are talking about. Welcome to Liquid Assets, where we dive into the issues shaping the future of water. I'm your host, Ravi Karani, and today I'm joined by Max Fraser-Krauss, a leading recruiter tackling the growing talent gap in the water sector. We're uncovering why this shortage exists, what it means for water sustainability, and how we can attract a new generation to fill these essential roles. From the challenges of recruiting tech-savvy talent to the urgent need for rebranding water work as a purpose-driven career, this episode will change the way that you think about water and the people behind it. Let's dive in.
Hi, my name is Max Fraser-Krauss. I'm a water industry recruiter. I work for a company called CM Industrial here in the UK.
Max, how are you doing today?
I'm well. Thanks for having me on, Ravi. How are you?
I am doing good. You and I are going to talk about the talent gap in water. This has actually come up a few times in a lot of the episodes that I've recorded in the past about the water industry just having a gap, right? Where are the people in the water industry? What do they do? I'd love to get your viewpoint on it. You are a recruiter, and I think this comes from a really interesting point because you're the person that's actually finding people to hire for other people. So let's jump into it, Max. I think the first thing is, let's just go ahead and define what the talent gap actually is, right? And why it's a concern for the water industry.
Sure. I mean, from my point of view, and this is something that I've found out from speaking to candidates, speaking to clients, and I mean, from what I can see, mainly in the UK, but also in the US and other parts of the world as well, where I've recruited. I mean, what I think the talent gap being is that we have a huge number of professionals in the water industry who are, maybe 50, 55, let's say 10, 15 years from retirement, who are extremely knowledgeable of the water industry. They've been in the industry for a long time and they know it really, really well. But they, unfortunately, and as they're allowed to live, they're going to retire soon. And the problem is, and the gap is that we haven't got anyone, or there are fewer people that are sort of joining the workforce that want to be in water. So we've got this issue where in the next, say, 10 or 15 years, unless obviously something is done about it, we might have a serious shortage of talent within the water industry, which naturally will potentially impact like the supply and treatment of water. If we have fewer and fewer water industry professionals, let's say wastewater operators, for example, if we have fewer of those, naturally that will impact the supply and treatment of it. So, I mean, that's from my point of view, that's where the gap is. We've got loads of experienced people who are going to leave the workforce soon, and when we haven't got enough people who are going to be who are joining it to replace it.
Actually, that opens up kind of a few questions, right? There's obviously a pipeline problem, right? You're having people, like you said, that are leaving the industry and not a quick enough rate of people that are actually coming in to fill those seats.
Yeah.
What is two questions? First of all, just for the audience to kind of understand what are these jobs that we're talking about? Are you referring to, you mentioned an example of wastewater. Are you mostly talking about municipal water, industrial water? What's the spectrum of these jobs that we're talking about?
I mean, I imagine it's across the board, but I mean, from what I've seen, it's a lot more on the municipal side. So obviously, which affects, drinking, potable water and wastewater, right? Potable and effluent, to use the technical terms. But I mean, we see it sort of, I guess, across the board: municipal water, industrial water. It's everyone really.
Okay, and then my second question is for the supply of new folks coming in. Why are there not? Is it like an educational problem that we're not teaching the right courses? Is it a fact that there's not enough money in the water world and I can go and get a job driving an Uber? What does that look like from the supply side?
I don't know. I honestly, I wish I knew the answer to that question because doing just a quick search on, I guess, the numbers. I mean, in the UK and in the US, I know that it's something like 1% or 2% of graduates, so people that have let's say between the ages of 21 and 25, who are leaving university, and there's 1% of those that are joining like either the energy or utility space. And then obviously further down on that, it's even fewer during the water industry. Couldn't tell you why, because I think because it's, I mean, it's a really, having worked in the industry for a few years now, it's a really cool industry to work in. It's, and you know that you're making a difference as well. I mean, if you think about it, like, you're impacting, I guess, the quality of water, or you're impacting, I guess, reducing waste, from on the wastewater side. So, I mean, I couldn't tell you why they're not joining. I could just tell you that it's happening.
Sure. And then if we kind of double click on the problem in itself, what does that look like? What's the implication of it? Like you said, in 10 to 15 years, we're going to have a shortage of folks in the industry. Is that a 10% shortage, a 20% shortage? Like how many seats are going to go unfilled?
I think it's something like 2,000 vacancies, but I'm sorry, 2,000 types of jobs. I think, and then it's like 60,000 vacancies or something. Actually,
oh my gosh,
that was yeah. So I mean, but if you think about it, if we've got a decent level of employment now, and then in 10 to 15 years we're going to have people leaving, and then, like I said, there's 1% of grads that are joining, then it's I guess the math speaks for itself, So the number I saw, it was 2,000 different types of job and 3,000 actual vacancies.
Got it. Okay. So now we have this 60,000 vacancies, right, or so that are gonna show themselves. If you were to wager a guess, or if we can brainstorm a few strategies on how to get people trained, what do you think? What do you think you can do in terms of reskilling? What does that look like?
I mean, there's you've got the short term, the immediate short term, which, I mean, from my own, I guess what I really think should be done is players, the big players, both these private companies like your Xyrems and your Veolias, who naturally, as market leaders, will have a wealth, a massive wealth of I don't know if they are doing like sort of, if you like, community outreach, but I think one of the things that would be really useful as an immediate solution is getting Veolia, getting Xyrem, getting all these other big name private companies to potentially skill people, well, grads in particular, but I mean, I suppose anyone who's interested. But I mean, naturally, when it comes to getting people interested, there's a whole other host of reasons that you need to address first, I think. I mean, for example, if you make the water industry a more attractive industry to work in, naturally, you'll have less of a trouble attracting people in the first place, right? That obviously stands to reason. So, for example, I guess one of the solutions I was going to bring something later, I mean, I suppose it comes to Kraus now. If you make the industry more attractive, either by making a bigger deal out of the importance of water, as I think one of the things that, and this is something I didn't know until I started working in the industry, is just how vital water is, but also just how scarce it is. I mean, I was watching some documentary about, I guess, the water problem, and it's something like 1% of surface water is potable. Some crazy stat about how obviously there's so much water in the world, but so little of it is usable, is drinkable. So I think making a bigger deal, first of all, about the water industry, about why water, you could see it as under the sort of the wider climate umbrella. That would be the first thing. So you make a big deal, you show people it's important, and then naturally those that are more eco-conscious, and obviously nowadays with the generation, is it Gen Z now we have?
I think it's Gen Z, the Zoomers,
the Zoomers, right? Yeah. So the Gen Zs are the most socially or eco-conscious generation we've seen so far, right? So naturally, they will be if we make a big deal to them and show that if you join the water industry, you'll be contributing to, quote unquote, saving the planet, contributing to that climate change issue, then, that's a big solution right there. So I think shouting about it is one thing. I guess if we're talking about the Zoomers again, they are also the most purpose-driven generation. So, if you make obviously organizations have a responsibility to make themselves attractive, and if they demonstrate their ability or demonstrate the attractiveness again, that will help them attract staff. So the combination of being purpose driven is a really big one. And in a post COVID world as well, flexible work. I mean, this is a really big or a key driver for them. So the ability to work from home, the ability to maybe even be they call it digital nomads. We can just work from anywhere.
Yes,
that would really help. That would really help as well. So, I mean, another thing that's really big and is, I guess, more pertinent when we're talking about getting the younger generation involved in water is the adoption of sort of technology in general. So, like the water industry is sort of almost, for those of us who work there, is infamously like slow to adopt, technology. So I guess expediting the adoption of technology, which again makes it appeal to this tech savvy generation that we have compared to, the Generation X, I think, those that are sort of, late 40s, mid 50s, early 60s, who are, inherently less tech savvy, absolutely no disrespect at all, but yeah, they will be because they haven't grown up in a world that is technologically advanced in the same way that perhaps you and I, Ravi, have, or, the Zoomers have. So that technology piece is also really important, I'd say.
I actually really love that list, right? I mean, if you kind of go back and start off with making it a bigger deal, like you said, right? Back to that documentary that you watched on water is vital and it is scarce. And underneath that climate umbrella, which with the Zoomers being where they are, there is definitely a chance to make something a little bit bigger, right? So that they can go ahead and find value in working these water careers. Because I was actually thinking about that of, you can get a bunch of millennials or even Gen X to kind of join the workforce and great, you can probably fill the seats. But if you really want that longevity that you had with the folks that are now in the water industry, they've been there, like you said at the beginning of this episode, for 30, 40 years, right? Working in the same positions. And Gen Z is going to have that same time scale because they're starting into the job markets today. And then I guess even rewinding the track a little bit to go to the generation that's even before them that are now going into college and probably are sitting in high school trying to figure out what they should actually go into next. And so
Sure.
completely, it is a messaging problem at heart. And it's funny you say that because messaging and storytelling have come up so many times on this podcast of like water just being a storytelling problem.
Yep. I mean, like I said, before I started working in recruitment and before I sort of switched over to the water market, I had absolutely no idea. I was just like, I'll turn the tap on and my water comes out, or I would turn the shower and I can have a shower. I had no idea about how absolutely vital it was. And I mean, if you think about it, of course it's vital. It makes absolute sense. It's a finite resource. I mean, I wouldn't go so far as to say we should treat it like oil and gas, for example, because I would argue it's even more important. I mean, like in the long term, we're probably going to have to deal with not using oil and gas, right? But we can't survive without water. We just can't. So it's even more important. So I mean, you mentioned obviously the high schoolers there, Ravi, and there was another really interesting YouTube video I saw about how we can get there. And this is more of a longer term solution. But I mean, it's gamification of the water industry. So there is, interesting enough, there's a mobile app called Water Battle. So it's, you can play it on your iPhone, you play it on your Android, and it's like a platform game, and it's about protecting water, right? And your parents can play along. If you have a smart meter at home, your parents can connect the smart meter to the app, and then based on your water usage, you can unlock like different levels. So imagine, I mean, obviously, high schoolers maybe aren't spending loads of time playing platform games and they're on their iPads.
Yeah.
But I mean, even if we're talking about, you guys call it elementary school, right? In the UK.
Elementary, higher school,
primary school. Yeah. If they're sat there playing this platform game and they're realizing how important water is, and obviously their parents are, being incentivized to save water, then, that's a huge, potentially would have a huge impact on people who maybe are thinking, maybe 10, 15-year-olds who are like, I don't know what I do with my life, but I really like this game. It's a bit of a stretch perhaps, but I mean, if you're taking those types of steps now, in 10 or 15 years, you might have a, 25-year-old that, that's thinking about what he wants to do with his or her life and thinking, yeah, let's go into war. It was a cool game. It seems like it's an important thing. And it's, if you plant the seed early, I mean, you've got this, I guess you're tapping into a larger market of potential talent.
Yeah, and I think you actually raise a really interesting point. This is a perfect segue into kind of how technology can help in closing the talent gap. But
yeah,
an interesting point that you actually just raise up is you have to change the rules of the game, right? The entire paradigm was changed because Ricky mentioned where millennials or Gen Z grew up in a tech native world.
yeah,
Boomers may not have that, right? Folks that grew up in the 60s and 70s, they just naturally lived in neighborhoods and they worked with their units where they physically met with people. Totally makes sense.
Sure.
But
sure.
There's case studies now where, you see folks or kids sitting on their phone and they're playing a game, but they're actually connected to many more people than you otherwise would be if you were kind of in, physically in your neighborhood by potentially playing a game, by actually gamifying something. And so I think if you start off with the first principles that we need to change the paradigm, or rather the paradigm is changing, what are the new rules that we need to play by? And if that means that you're in a tech native world, if that means that you use, Roblox or whatever you're going to use to actually build, like a water world in there connected to your smart meter, so you can actually, it drives the same narrative and it aids with storytelling in a much more comfortable narrative compared to what Gen Z or Zoomers are used to playing with versus somebody that, is thinking about this from an older mindset. And so completely, I think, I don't think it's actually that far-fetched to think that we might need to think about new storytelling and messaging ways to actually get the word across. Let's come back to today, right? So in the 10 to 15 year gap, it seems like our only real supply of folks that can help us fill the talent gap, like you mentioned, is Gen Z and probably millennials and some Gen Xers. Given that, what do you think technology can do to close the talent gap? I mean, points 2 and 3 you mentioned is flexibility, right? Flexibility all came around because of COVID, because we were on Zoom, we were working on our computer. And then, like you said, water has been slow in adopting technology. So with this world of technology, what can we do?
Well, I mean, naturally, technology and I suppose specifically automation will naturally make jobs easier, won't it? So, I mean, if we're making jobs easier, utilizing technology in that sense will make someone's job easier. And I mean, I'm doing like you, Ravi, but I mean, the easier my job is, the more likely I am to do it. So that's other an attraction sort of piece. Again, that's what I guess one of the things I'd say. But I think, I mean, when we're talking about technology usage in the water industry, it's demonstrating how, for example, right, you've got digital twin now is really big. Using that can really help with efficiency gains. So, I mean, I would honestly think that the technology that we have at our fingertips now is what makes the industry attractive again. I mean, I feel like I'm repeating myself now, but I mean, it comes back to making it more attractive. So the technology companies that are, I guess there's a lot of tech startups, both, I mean, obviously I speak to tech startups in California all the time. There's always raining startups doing some really interesting stuff. But I mean, the making the industry more efficient and making the industry, I guess, less frustrating to work in will help, I guess, retain people in the industry. Interestingly enough, I spoke to a candidate over the summer. He left the industry. He'd been in it for like 20 years. So he's probably close to the Gen X I'm talking about. But because I asked him sort of what about the role that I was speaking about, which was sort of was with a tech startup, a SaaS wastewater startup. I asked him what was interesting about the role and why he was interested in pursuing it. And he said that because what they're doing is finally they're trying to digitize. They're trying to push technology, be on the cutting edge of technology in the water industry. And the reason that I left the industry in the first place is because that wasn't happening. Mm-hmm. So I think, the implementation of technology will make people who have a genuine passion for the industry, but who have been frustrated by the industry or the lack of sort of progression, if you like, in the industry, will make them, either want to rejoin. Like I said, that's just one example. I'm sure there's loads of examples of people that would have been pushing for it and left, and now maybe could see that there's companies doing so they might want to make them come back. Or those that are considering leaving the industry, it might make them think twice about leaving because they're seeing an actual, maybe not a revolution, but a huge change towards more, I guess, to more digital, digitalized.
Yeah, yeah, totally makes sense. You kind of sit at this inflection point in the pipeline, right? You're kind of as a recruiter, almost in a sense, you're like the first lines of seeing the supply and demand of people problem.
Sure.
When you're looking at roles to hire, what are you just qualitatively like? What are you seeing out there? What are we hiring for right now? Who are you interviewing, and what does that pipeline look like for you?
I mean, one of the most in-demand roles that I've seen, not necessarily that I've worked on personally, but that I know people are looking for, is like operators. So that's why I mentioned it at the start there. Like wastewater engineers or wastewater plant operators, particularly in the US, is huge. I mean, the roles. There's a lot of roles that I work on that are more commercially focused, like sales focused. But I mean, it's all about the. I mean, particularly in the UK, it's demand for the experience in the municipal space. So, for example, there was in fact, this summer just gone, and last summer, there was like 4 or 5 roles that were all exactly the same for the same company that wanted municipal experience. So the experience working with water utilities, either in the UK or in the US, which naturally makes, obviously it makes your job easier, but it also makes your job harder. It just tells you just how in demand municipal experience is.
Yeah, completely. I mean, I guess if you're kind of thinking about municipal folks that you're hiring for, right? And you end up with this current where like reality catchiness that you end up happening, which is you have a shortage of operators that are probably going to buy the tech solutions that is like this SaaS wastewater company. But at the same rate, you don't have the operators that are sitting there that can actually buy the technology that they're going to implement, right? So it's almost this circuitous problem where you have everybody that wants to work on the tech, but you have nobody that's going to buy the tech because there's not somebody sitting there that's going to actually make the purchase.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, that was the way that I've heard it described best. Is I was speaking to the gentleman who in the UK who's more on the older side, and he said we've got loads of guys that know loads about water but are not tech savvy at all. And then we've got loads of kids. He said kids as well. I think he meant talking to me, but loads of kids that know loads about tech but have absolutely no experience. So I mean, it's the same type of thing in that we've got, there's this almost like this vicious circle, like I say, in that there's no sort of meeting in the middle. There's no crossover. There's no equilibrium.
Yeah. Dang. I want to kind of pivot over to you really quick, Max. And
sure.
What makes you tick? Like, why do you do this? Can we go through kind of your history a little bit of what drives you to do the work that you do in water?
I mean, that's a good question. Couldn't have gone with that one. Why do I work in water? Well, initially, this is probably not the best answer, but initially I started working in partly because I started working with a different manager and that was his. But I mean, since working in the water industry, I've become a bit of a water nerd. Like I said, I watch documentaries about water, which usually sound really, really nerdy, but geeking out about water is great. But I mean, like I said,
you are on a water podcast, so it's totally fine.
Yeah, I'm preaching to the choir. Yeah. But no, like I said at the start, the water industry is a really interesting industry to work in. So being able to, I guess, contributing to that is, I guess, a big part of what makes me tick on the professional side. I mean, I also consider myself an environmentalist. It's nice to feel like you're making a difference, either by helping a company or hiring for a company that is, helping to save water, obviously enhancing water efficiency, which obviously is, making sure that we're addressing water scarcity issues, or by helping companies that are, making water more available to people around the world, either through, say, desalination or increased, sort of increased testing, which naturally will ensure that the water that is being consumed by people is of higher quality and, is less likely to cause disease, for example, less likely to do damage, So, I'll be honest that initially it was less of a choice, but since then, and since realizing how important it is and how interesting it is, the opportunity to contribute to, I guess water security, I guess is probably the best way of describing it, is really what I enjoy and what I, why I guess I want to stay in the water industry now.
And what were you doing before? Your manager switched you or force switched you into this water job?
So I was recruiting in the chemical industry. So yeah, which obviously there's a little bit of crossover because obviously there's water companies that are, water companies that provide chemicals, but it was more on the oil and gas side. And I partially switched over because post-COVID, obviously the oil market wasn't in the best shape. So it made sort of fiscal sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And you obviously moved from oil and gas to water. What are the high level differences in candidates or your process or potentially the larger supply and demand problem that we're talking about in water? Like, does that exist in oil and gas? What is the comparison of your job function in both of those, right? Because it's kind of cool. You get to see from a pipeline perspective the supply and demand problem of people in two very different industries.
Yep. Well, I mean, for a brief stint there, actually, I should have mentioned this. I worked in batteries, battery materials, and that was there was a little bit of a transition phase because we thought, the oil price is negative, or the oil market is in a really bad state. So let's do something a bit more buoyant. So I worked in that for a minute, and I guess I spoke to a lot of oil and gas professionals before and after the pandemic, and so many of them said, particularly in places like Texas, which is obviously such a massive oil and gas hub, and obviously still is. But I mean, speaking to people in Texas, speaking to people in Aberdeen up in Scotland, which is obviously another big hub, a lot of them wanted to get out of the oil and gas industry because they didn't see a future. For obviously, which to me seems pretty obvious, because we are moving away from our reliance on oil and gas. But obviously, that was one thing that I saw, that people, or there was a bigger influx of candidates moving away from oil, which seems to sort of mirror, I guess, the global mood, if you like.
Interesting, because in a sense, the problem is the same, right? You end up having a churn of talent where in the water standpoint, you have folks that are just getting older and ending up, retiring. And then people in the oil industry that just don't see it as a future, given what you said.
Sure.
With that, obviously two very different problems, but let's move back to water again. How do you solve the retention problem if we're talking about that, right? Like, I think you mentioned there was a guy in an earlier example who had left the water industry, and then you were interviewing him for this kind of SaaS wastewater company who now found that the kind of technology was what interested him. Mm-hmm. Like, let's talk about retention.
Yeah. Talking about retention. So, I mean, I think it's the same as every other industry, really. And I think we're talking about staff retention comes down to, one, how they're treated. I mean, I don't think anything I'm about to say is going to be rocket science, but I mean, you'd be surprised, So, for example, how they're treated, I mean, and that comes down to pay. Obviously, it'll always come down to pay. I mean, I don't know what it's like in the US, but in the UK, we've got a bit of a cost of living crisis. So, obviously, making sure that people feel well paid and making sure that they can pay their bills or pay their mortgage, and making sure they've got food on the table. It's a bit of a drastic example, but pay is obviously a big thing. Ensuring that people are paid, but also company culture is a huge thing. There's a client I work with at the moment they've just gone through a massive restructuring, and they had a bit of a toxic culture issue, and they now don't. People don't want to work in places where they don't feel, where there's a toxic culture, or if they don't feel valued. Of course, it's not rocket science, but people will if they're happy at work, they will likely stay in their jobs. Another thing that we actually implement here, and we have done for the past 18 months, is the four day work week. It's huge for staff retention, because if you think about it, if you join a company that does a 4-day week and then you leave and you go to a 5-day week, I don't know if what your working schedule at the moment is, Ronnie, but I mean, when you get used to having a 3-day weekend every weekend, going back to a 2-day weekend, would be crazy, So, I mean, that's, I couldn't answer a question specific to water, but I mean, in terms of staff retention, pay and organizational culture, and maybe work, obviously 4-day week would not be possible for everyone, naturally. But I mean, if staff are happy, and then maybe another example, like I mentioned earlier, is that flexibility, be able to work from home if you like, or having that hybrid arrangement would really will drive retention. And for me that seems common sense, but obviously it obviously isn't, because we have people that still complain about toxic work and say not feeling valued or feeling mismanaged or whatever. So obviously it's much easier said than done.
When we look at the culture of these municipalities, right, if we're going to kind of zoom into that for a second.
Sure.
The majority of them are public. I know in the US, a lot of them are public-based entities that are usually run by city, county governments, or they're potentially like part of a water district. Sure. There's a handful of like private companies, but
that's your American Waters, right? And
yeah. And so from that kind of mindset, do you feel that it is just because it's closer to like a public institution that the culture is the way that it is, and maybe the pay is slightly lower? Like, if we were to really have a magic wand and wave something, like would you privatize water? I don't know, and then raise the cost so you can then go ahead and pay people a little bit more. I don't know. I'm throwing some weird stuff out there, but I'm wondering, like, what do you think is going to drive those two main levers that you just said, right? Pay and culture.
Sure. I mean, I wouldn't privatize water. That's how it's been in the UK. I don't know if you've seen recently, Ravi, but one of the biggest, in fact, the biggest water utility in the UK, Thames Water, which saves, I think it's 14 or 15 or 16 million people, is in billions and billions and billions of pounds of debt. And I mean, the thing about the way that it works in the UK is that you don't have a choice over who supplies your water. It depends on where you live. So, for example, we're not based in London. We're based up in Leeds, which is in the north of England. So you don't get a choice on your water provider, which naturally means that the water utilities in the UK have a monopoly. So I wouldn't privatize, because they've demonstrated, and maybe I'm being a bit cynical and I don't want to get too political on this, but they demonstrate that they aren't doing as good a job as they perhaps should have done. So I think one of the biggest things that will help with pay is to make, and I mentioned this at the start, is to make water viewed as more of a precious resource, and therefore, which means if you make it more valuable, or you make people realize how much more valuable it is, naturally you can drive the price up for it. I mean, if you look at the prices of petrol and diesel, it's so much more than your water bill is. Now, I don't know how expensive water is in the US for you, Ravi, but I can tell you that my water bill is a if you pardon the pun, is a drop in the ocean compared to how much it would be to fill up your car, and water is, in my opinion, a more valuable resource. So if you were to make water more expensive, one, it would mean there'd be more revenue for those water utilities. And two, it would have that knock-on effect of making people realize, making people realize that they can't just leave the tap on, and it would make them value water more. So it would be if you and it goes back to what we're saying about the paradigm shift. If you make water more valuable, maybe we'll realize it. They will use less of it, which will mean that they're contributing to more water security.
As you kind of moved into the water industry from a kind of non-water industry, what is one or two things that you learned that somebody that would be your counterpart didn't know?
My counterpart that hasn't yet joined the water industry.
Yeah, what's something in the world that somebody otherwise would not know now that you're in the water industry?
That's a great question. I knew how a flow meter works. I know how like a valve works. If you imagine like a valve in a pipe. It's at the top of my head. Those are at least the two examples, and those are a little bit more sort of operational. But but obviously, I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I'm a technical expert on, my job is not to know how a flow meter works, but it's to understand the water market as a whole. And obviously that's why I wanted to talk about the talent gap rather than maybe talk about what OEM is doing what, because,
Sure.
because I'm not a technical expert. I don't have as much of an appreciation for, say, a photometer or a pH measure or a turbidity, measure instrument, I should say, than someone who has been in the water industry, and someone that I would recruit, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally makes sense. Max, I ask everybody this question before we end the episode, and
Sure.
is there a movie, a book, or a show you mentioned actually a few times that you watched this documentary that has had a profound impact or changed the way that you look at the world, or potentially changed the way that you look at the world of water?
There's a film with Mark Ruffalo in it. You might have mentioned already. Is it called Dark Waters? It's about the DuPont water or the DuPont chemical spill.
Yep.
That was pretty crazy. And then there is also the documentary. It was actually on Netflix. It was part of the Netflix Explained series. It's like 25 minutes. It's really bite-sized. It's really easy to watch. I mean, I think it's called something like the water scarcity issue or something like that. And it explains the issue. And it made me sort of think twice, even about like flushing the toilet, and you realize just how much water is used when you flush the toilet. And I mean, if ever my girlfriend leaves the tap on, I have a proper go at her for that. We can, it's sort of like, do you realize how little water we have in the world?
Yeah.
So I bet those two. If you want a drama, then the film with Mark Ruffalo, or if you want, I guess, if you want more informative, the Netflix documentary.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Max, thanks a ton for coming on the show. This has been super insightful.
No problem. Thanks for having me on, Ravi.
If you want to listen to Liquid Assets, you can find us at liquidassets.cc or anywhere else you get your podcasts or on YouTube today.